Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and I'm here with a behind-the-scenes video. It's been a while since I've done one of those, and the thing that's behind me is going to be the forefront of it, and so I'm doing a behind-the-scenes with behind stuff. Anyway, enough of that. I'm here to talk to you about what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to be doing a build guide, and this is the first of many because I've got a lot of different cases to build. NZXT has been kind enough to send me two, one of which is here. So this is the NZXT H7 Flow RGB, which is going to be the main focus of this video. You'll also notice the Kraken Elite 280 RGB all-in-one cooler and the Corsair RM1000E, alongside a few other things, one of which is NZXT's F120 RGB core fans. So lots of RGB going on here, as you'd expect. Now I'm planning on doing a build now, and then I'm going to give you some sort of behind the scenes shots of it and maybe just talk through. It's been a while since I've done that, so I thought it might be fun to experiment. There's going to be some interesting things along the way because for some reason NZXT sent me 280mm cooler instead of a 360mm, so this case takes up to 360, so we're maybe going to have a gap there. It's going to be a fun experiment. Quick side note, you might notice I'm using the Rode Pod mic USB, so that's new, but it's also with XLR, so this has both USB and XLR connections. And it's currently running into the Rodecaster Pro 2, but it sounds pretty decent, I think. It's also got a nice windshield on it. You can see you can take this off, and then it's got a pretty stealth black look underneath. But now I'm doing this build during the day, and it's a very sunny day, so it's very hot. So if you hear traffic noise, it's because I've got windows open, so apologies for that. Hopefully there won't be too much of it, but it's quite warm in England today. So, and let's get started with this build. I'm going to do two cameras, so you'll get to see this face cam one, which is the Elgato face cam, by the way, that I'm using for this face-on view for when I'm talking to the camera, and then we're going to do a top-down shot from that camera over there, so you can see sort of behind the scenes, but also live. I'm going to do my usual recording at the same time, so I'm going to be using 3 different cameras, maybe 4. But hopefully it'll be entertaining. Let me know in the comments what you think and whether these behind the scenes videos are useful, because I've done a few of them, but it has been quite some time, because I do take a lot of extra time on top of what already takes quite a while. Because what people don't realize is building these PCs takes a while. Building a PC isn't too bad. Building a PC and recording all the footage while you're doing it takes longer. Building a PC and recording all the footage while you're doing it, plus adding in extra stuff that you don't need to, takes even longer. So, for example, got this Kraken cooler. I'm going to try and demonstrate how you'd install it on both AMD and Intel boards, so that I can include that in the guide and setup process for it, which obviously means I have to fish out 2 motherboards and take all the attachments and swap them around and do all that. So it's extra time that you wouldn't need to spend doing all that, and then just every step of the way. But hopefully give some interesting insights into the various different things. Plan is to start with the RM1000E, which is Corsair's fully modular power supply, and I think it's ATX 3.0. It's ATX 3.0 PCIe Gen 5 cable included in there, so it's perfect for all your 40 series graphics cards needs. I want to set this up first and show all the different things that you usually want to do beforehand, including where to install the cables on the motherboard and the logic of where they plug into the various different graphics cards and things, and then go into all the depth on this. Now I do this for a lot of different PSUs, and you might say why, because it's always the same with modular power supplies, but people look specifically for the one they've bought, and I've seen some success in it. And if you've watched any of those, you might have seen I've tried to improve them every time I've done it and be a bit more detailed in each bit. For example, on the last one I did, I included guides on both the sort of traditional Type 4 graphics cards connections and then also the Type 5, because this does both. And you might not have a 40 series graphics card, or you might be running AMD or Intel, so I try and cover everything in my guides, and it's a bit tricky because there's a lot to think of. This is the NZXT C1200. watts is a little bit smaller than that. Not much in it, but marginally smaller than a larger wattage power supply. Pretty interesting. So another highlight is this is a small form factor power supply that Corsair does. It's an SFXL power supply. So it's modular, but it's designed for like ITX builds, tiny cases. And again, this is 1000 watts too. So they've got a really small PSU, which is still 80 plus gold and has all that power. And I'll be doing a separate video on this in the near future as well, because I'm going to be doing a build on the Corsair 2000D. So with these guides, obviously I've got all the cables out here, and it looks like quite intimidating, but now I want to try and work out what cable's what, set them out in a logical way so I can explain what they do, and also demonstrate them in each of the sort of variants to explain it all. First world YouTuber problems is just the sheer number of plastic ties I have to take off. They make things look neat, and they keep the cables in order, obviously, but geez, the number of PSUs I've had to deal with and taking off these flipping cable ties, I'm fed up with it. So I'm going to start with the motherboard power, 24 pin and 2 8-pin CPU power connectors. And it's fairly straightforward, but worth demoing. I've taken to doing this outside of the case for the last year probably, because it's so much easier to show. Obviously, I don't want people to get confused and do it beforehand, but plugging these in while the PSU is installed in the case is a pain, and then trying to show plugging them into the motherboard while it's in the case and getting the lighting good is really difficult as well. So the advantage of doing it now separately makes life a lot easier, and I can just pull the motherboard out of the box before I go about installing it and use that. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So for this demonstration, I'm going to be using the Gigabyte Z790 Aurorus Elite AX. Now, I used this recently in the LAN Call 3 build guide and review that I did. I'm having to reuse it because I don't have loads of Intel CPUs or even Intel motherboards at the moment. I've got some, but they're already in other cases, and it means having to take things apart. So I actually had to take a case apart and put this back in the box and clean it up. And you're going to be using different RAM, but the same CPU, same motherboard. I'm going to use that for demo purposes now to show them this, and then also the setup of the cooler and the NVMe drive beforehand, and go through all those different things. But it's currently just reboxed. Now I will be doing some other boards soon. I've got a Gigabyte board for the ITX build, but this is basically a behind the scenes view of what's going to happen. So it's all just stored away, stashed away. I've still got the CPU in there. So what I like to do, just because it's much easier, is just set this up in a good position for the camera, for the top-down camera. And then what I can do is demo the install of the 8 pins and the 24 pin and get it in a good shot so it's easy to see what I'm doing. Actually, one of the biggest faffs is getting the 24 pin in and then back out again afterwards, because obviously you don't really want to plug your cables in now, but like I said, for lighting purposes, and you've got a clear shot of what's going on, plugging this cable in beforehand sort of demos nicely what to do and how you do it. But it can be a pain because it's obviously not attached to the desk in any way. If you're wondering, by the way, as well, this is just a cutting mat that I'm using here. So this is just a cutting mat that I bought off Amazon. I think it's got some nice lines on it. It looks quite nice in photographs and whatnot. It's actually upside down for the more observant viewer. And I am standing on an electrostatic discharge mat, so to get rid of that static electricity. So that's under my feet. Most people probably use it on the desk and be having hands on, but I'm actually barefoot on top of it, so static doesn't go through and damage things. So what you can see is this is my main camera, and although you can actually reposition it on the rail because these clips are actually able to be moved around and you can basically move it up and down the rail, it's much easier to just keep it in one place. It is powered, so you see there's a cable coming out of it, so rather than having a battery in this camera, it actually runs straight to the mains, which makes life a lot easier because you don't have to constantly keep changing the batteries. But I can also adjust the height up and down of this railing system, and then obviously zoom in and out with the lens as well. But what it does mean is if I'm trying to get a shot like this with a motherboard, but then, or with PSU, I then, if I zoom in, sometimes need to then reposition things, so I end up like moving the motherboard over, and then move the motherboard over here, and then move this around. So, and I could move the camera, but it'd be much easier to not do that, to just zoom in and out. It's quite fun though. I do like this setup. This rail is probably one of the best things I bought. It does sort of take up a lot of room, and it doesn't look great in talking head pieces like right now. It doesn't look that amazing because it's kind of messy, but for top-down shots, it's just amazing, and that is a lot of what I do for these builds. So that's the PSU motherboard connection set up. Final sort of shot to show what it would look like, although obviously in the case. Now what I want to show is making sure you plug all the cables you need in beforehand. I think that's pretty important to make sure you've got all the right cables plugged in at the PSU side. But the trouble I've got now is also to demonstrate all those things and do it in a way that's easy to see. So I actually have to unplug and replug a lot of things. Obviously I've got to disconnect from the motherboard, but I'm also going to take them out of the power supply unit side so I can show the PCIe set up for the graphics card and make it clear without loads of cables in the way. So this is the sort of effort that I go to. Maybe people don't notice, but obviously showing this is important if you're learning and want to know more about what to do. Actually, the next logical thing is probably going to be other motherboard things. So I'm going to show how to set up hard disk drive and SATA using both the power cables and the connections, data connections. Demonstrate that. So for that purpose, I have these drives which I never actually use. I bought literally just for the sake of it. Although this one is actually from, that's a 1 terabyte Seagate Barracuda drive, which shows you how old it is, because 1 terabyte is pretty tiny by modern standards. And then this is also a tiny Kingston drive. So I'm going to use those as demo, and then also it's RGB hub from NZXT. Makes sense, right? It's NZXT build. So here's a crazy old story. This is my Gigabyte 3090, which I've had for whatever, a year or two. Time flies. And I'm literally just using it now. It isn't even in a PC. It's just been in its box for a while. Just using it for demoing how to plug in cables. It's pretty crazy. I could obviously sell it, but then I wouldn't have a card to demonstrate with. So that's YouTuber problems right there. Another first world problem for you. Obviously, some GPUs have 3 or 4 connections. I'd like to be able to demonstrate that, but sadly mine doesn't have that, so I can't actually show it. So I just have to talk about it in the video and say, well, if you need a third one, just do this. And now I've got another first world problem in that I'm going to have to get out a 4070 from a recent build just to show how to plug the cables in. So this is the Corsair 5000D Airflow RGB, which I crafted recently, and I'm actually trying to keep this in this state because what I want to do is a video to compare this case with the NZXT case that I'm building, because apparently people were searching for that with the previous models. People wanted to know what the H7 was like versus the 5000D. So I figure 5000D versus H7 Flow RGB could be good because they're both RGB cases. They both come with RGB fans, and this one is obviously over the top with its RGB. But I mean, ideally, I want to keep the GPU in here, but I'm going to have to reuse it just for a clip of this PSU. And now I'm going to put it back again. Might seem mad, but storage it'll be easier. And for when I get to that versus video, it will then be ready to put them side by side and compare it. Hello. So I'm on day 2, which is why I've got a different top on. Mostly because I was very busy yesterday. But now I'm going to get into the Kraken Elite 280 RGB. Now this, the Kraken series, is one of my favourite coolers and has been for a long time. So the Z73 RGB and the standard non-RGB version I've been using in my main build basically for the last 2 or 3 years, just because I really like the pump head. So this liquid pump head has the has a display on it, which you can display all sorts of things on there, GIFs and other things. But the things that I like to do is the dual setup with CPU and GPU temperatures. And that means that you can see at a glance the temps of your machine without having to open up any hardware monitoring. Now, it's not a perfect system. It won't give you the exact measurements of all the cores on your CPU, for example, but you will be able to see at a glance if there's something horribly wrong, as in your CPU is running really hot or there's another problem. And so I've always found that really cool. And this is obviously an updated version of that. Now, they have made some interesting changes to it, because the previous RGB version, obviously this is an RGB version, but this is now the Elite, used different fans, and those were daisy chain fans. So NZXT had the AER fans, which were daisy chainable, which meant that you had to have a cable running from it. And I've done a couple of videos on it, so if you want to find out more about that, you can. But essentially, if you had a 360mm radiator, it would go... it would have a fan, and then it would go have an in-out cable. So there'd be a cable, a small cable that goes from one fan to the next, and then from the next fan to the next fan, and then the final fan would have another cable that goes from that into the pump head. They've now done away with that daisy chain connection, which is a kind of a shame, because that carried both power and RGB lighting in that system, and then you just have to connect up one setting. I think it was power. Maybe it was just RGB. I've done so many fans recently. But it made life a little bit easier. But it was kind of complicated, and I got a lot of questions about it in the videos because people got confused by the system of how it worked. And so now NZXT's kind of ditched that and gone back to sort of 2 cables per fan. So I'm going to have to explain that logic. You do get an RGB controller in the box. So it notes on the box there's an RGB controller, which will be similar to this one, which essentially has 3 RGB connections on it. And then it just has USB and SATA power on the other end. So fairly straightforward. So that just does the RGB. And then obviously you need to get the power, which the power from these fans, and actually now I'm talking about it, it was the same on the old ones. So the power from the fans goes into the pump head. There's a breakout cable. So a cable with multiple connections on it that has the power, USB and SATA connection, so it connects to the power supply unit, and then it also connects to the fans, so all of the fans plug in. So if you've got a 360mm radiator, you have 3 fan power connections that connect up to the pump. That is then powered by your PSU, and the pump itself is then connected to the motherboard as well via both USB and AIO pump header or CPU fan header. That all sounds quite complicated putting it like that, but actually this should be fairly straightforward. But I'm going to do an in-depth video on it because I want to talk about all the different connections for this, where to plug everything in, and to show both Intel and AMD setups. I'm going to stick to Intel 1700 and AMD's AM5 because it's obviously the more recent. Hopefully, if people are buying this, that's what they've also got as their setup. Because there's obviously also a lot. 1156, for example, 1155. The older version is 2066 on Intel, but people probably aren't buying those boards as much anymore, so I don't know if it's worth covering every single difference. So I figure I'll just do Intel and AMD, but then also just talk about the setup of the fans on this radiator. So unfortunately, they only sent me 280mm because I'd like to be able to demonstrate the 360. But what are you going to do? The logic's basically the same. The breakout cable on this will have connections with 3 fans, even though only 2 are included. Whether you could do push-pull or not, I don't know. You could probably get splitter cables and then run them into the pump head. Or use a separate fan controller. But whether push-pull is even necessary. So 280mm obviously uses larger fans anyway, so it should get some decent cooling. But it looks nice, right? It's a nice looking one, or at least in the box. I rate this series. This uses Acertec Gen 7 pump. So for those that don't know, all-in-one coolers, generally speaking, are all based on the same technology. So every manufacturer, NZXT, Corsair, whoever, they all use Acertec. So there's a company called Acertec that manufactures the pump, the rights to the pump, the technology behind it, and the way that closed-loop system works. And so basically everybody that has that system then just puts their own fans and their own sort of branding and design on it. So obviously the pump head with its sort of display is NZXT's, but underneath that is an Acertec pump. Now this is Gen 7. Gen 8 is apparently the latest or more recent. So this is a little bit older, but it's obviously newer than the original generation, previous Kraken coolers. So it will give better cooling performance. And according to other reviewers out there, Gen 7 runs quieter than Gen 8 as well. So that's worth bearing in mind. We're interested to see how I go with the setup. So I'm going to unbox this now and then run through a setup of it, all the different logic, 2 different motherboard setups, explain the fan logic and more. And then I'm obviously also going to unbox the fans, the separate fans, and consider the wiring of those too. And then I've got to get the case out and see what's going on there. I think that comes with 3 fans as standard. And I believe they're the same duo fans that this one has. Or core fans. So NZXT has got like core and duo fans now. Yeah, core fans. RGB core fans. So stick with me and see what goes on there. So I got a fairly detailed guide in here on how to set it up, which is annoying. I'm still going to do a video on it because I think video is easier for some people to explain and just to understand, and it will look nicer. I always feel like this lot kind of looks intimidating when you first get out of the box. If you don't know what you're doing, obviously, if you're doing Intel installation, you don't need this, you don't need this. You only need half of these, depending on which one you're doing. You obviously need to work out where these bits on the back plate go and other things, and then which way around do the fans go, and which way around does the pump go, and other things like that. And you've also got these cables, which look pretty intimidating, but this is the breakout cable. So I'm going to show each of these bits individually now, capture footage of each of them, so I can talk about them individually, and it's working out the format of it. So I'm going to do that now. So one of the things I've noticed immediately is there is enough screws in here to do push-pull on this radiator. Obviously there's not enough fans, and I don't know if I've got any other 140mm fans that I can use. I might just have a quick look in my fan cupboard and see how we get on. So what I have found is that I've got these 140mm duo fans. Now these aren't the same fans, and I suspect that they probably have different fan speeds. And they also have different RGB lighting as well, because if you look at them, you'll see these sort of have the lighting rings around the outside, and then the fan in the center is not lit up. Whereas these core fans obviously have the RGB in the fins instead. So I expect the design is probably different. I should look at the specs. But they are 140mm, so I can at least demonstrate that it's possible and how to do it briefly. So I think I might do that because I think it's interesting, and it's this sort of thing that I like to add into my videos to sort of show if someone's thinking about doing it, what to do, because it's really easy to make the mistake of, okay, these fans are there. All I need to do is to put more fans on it. But now if you did this, those are now the wrong way, and both fans are actually acting against each other when you really want them to be working together. And now obviously you also need to think about cables. So these cables have to be a different way around. They'd have to be that way. And then you end up with quite a fat thing. And you've also got to work out how to connect it to your case and whether that'll even fit. I'm half tempted to do it just to show it's possible. But then obviously note that you wouldn't want to do this because these are different fans. Might do that. The only drama I'd have is there's obviously only 3 RGB connections on the hub, and I now have 4 fan connectors, so I'd need 2 hubs, which is fine because I do have that. This might be overkill, but I think it could be interesting. Make for an interesting video. Try and make the videos a bit more interesting and engaging. So I might do it, even though it's wrong technically. So I've just looked it up. This is for the F120 fans, but there is a big difference between them. So the duo fans, which is the ones with the ring on both sides, although they spin at the same speed, so they got between 500 RPM and 1800 RPM, they actually have much different airflow. So the duo fans 48.58 CFM versus 78.86 on the core fans. And there's obviously static pressure differences as well. And so they're actually quite a bit different. So you probably definitely shouldn't combine them. I'm going to, and then I'm going to talk about why you shouldn't and show the specs differences. But obviously I can't demo, sadly, 2 lots of the same fans, which would be ideal if I could. I don't even know if I can do push-pull in the case, is the other consideration. Anyway, I might just show the setup of it and demonstrate how you do it. Could be complicated, but I think it'd be worth doing. And this is exactly why I like to do this sort of thing, because I've just been a massive idiot, because obviously I've done the push-pull setup now, but how are you going to install that in the case? You can't. You can't install this in the case now, because the fans screws have to go through the case, through the fan and into the radiator. Normally you'd mount the radiator onto the case with these tiny screws. Obviously you can't do that. You can't do that there. So you'd have to mount through the case. I don't even know whether that's possible, but the point, I can still use this clip, I can still use this content, because the point is to demonstrate actually the way to put the fans around. So that's what I wanted to get across. So now both in this format, obviously the air is getting sucked in from this direction. So the idea here is I'm installing it in the case, or it will be like this orientation. So the pump sits over the CPU, and then the radiator mounted to the top of the case, and then you've got air being sucked up through the radiator and then pulled up through the radiator on the other side from these fans. Whether these mounted on top of the case or inside, maybe you mount through the top of the case into those fans and into the radiator, which you obviously have to be careful with the screws because they're really only designed to go into the fan and into the radiator. But that's how you could set it up. The other question is whether I make this into a video on its own. Like, do you do a basic setup guide? Because most people probably wouldn't do push-pull. Is it necessary? Will it make any difference? Maybe I could do a comparison video to show it with and without, but the problem is I've got the wrong fans. You wouldn't do it like this. This would be a bad idea. It would work. It would work, but the airflow wouldn't be right, potentially. The fans might spin at different speeds. They've got different airflow potential. They could be fighting each other, or at least hindering each other. They're not flowing in different directions, but the airflow just wouldn't be as good. I think it'd still work, and I have actually done it previously. I ran Lian Li fans on one side and NZXT on another, on the other side, which is even more crazy, but it worked and I had good cooling. But I've never done actually tests to see what the difference is, and unfortunately I don't have 2 lots of either of these 140mm. Or do I? And here's the problem with doing push-pull. Now I've got loads of cables to deal with. So I'm going to quickly demonstrate which cable is which, so that's clear. Assume no knowledge on the part of anybody. That's not to say people are idiots, but it's better to be clear and precise. So once you've done the RGB, so we can move that out of the way. But now I've got 4 power cables to deal with. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because I mean, it's just now a mess. You can see what I was talking about. With the previous fans, you used to daisy chain, so you didn't have all this. You just had one cable went into there, one cable into there, and then they just plug into the pump head. Now you've got all these cables. You've got a mess, and then you've got all the fan cables as well. Breakout cable, which looks pretty crazy and can be pretty intimidating when you sort of unfurl it. But really, this is the end that connects to the pump, and then this goes to the CPU. That goes to USB, and then these are SATA power for your PSU, and then fan power. So I'm just going to demonstrate that. So what you'll see now is obviously we've got the pump is coming out here. We've got 3 fans connected. Obviously we've now got a 4th one. Where does that go? Well, the answer is get yourself a wire splitter, and then if you look at the cables, if we detach these, if you look closely at these, you'll see that one of them, which is actually the closest one, has 4 pins in it, whereas the rest have 3. So what I'd recommend is putting this connection in here. So this is actually a Noctua thing, but you can get another fan splitter cable, and then you end up with 2 connections. So we can connect 2 fans into here. Like this. And that's 2 fans running off one. And then obviously, then you can put the other 2 on there. So then you've got all 4 connected to the pump head. Now, whether it's actually rated to power that many, I'm not sure, but you have got SATA power, so the SATA power should be enough to cope with all of those. Here's some first world sacrifices that I make for the sake of content. So I've just installed all the brackets and whatnot on this motherboard, on this small ITX Gigabyte motherboard, and now I'm going to have to remove them all because I'm probably not going to use this cooler on this particular build. Extra time spent on something just for the sake of making one video, because I'm not even going to use this motherboard in a build, but it is nice to have these extra parts that you can use so you can show in depth the steps for each of the build things. It's like I said, I was going to do Intel 1700 as my main build, but if someone wants to do AM5, I can now show them the process for that. So I figure at some point I'm going to do a comparison video to talk about the differences between the fans, because I've got 2 lots of our 120 RGB fans. We've got the core fans, which is these ones on the bottom row, and they are the ones that have the fins that light up. And then we've got the duo fans, which I did previously with the H9 Elite, that are duo because they have rings on either side with RGB lighting on. So it's going to be a personal preference in terms of the aesthetic, but as I've said, they actually have different performance metrics as well, so the specifications are slightly different. So that'll be interesting. But they do set up the same way, so they both have RGB and power connections. They both use the same RGB hub. So now I'm going to go through and plug them in to a couple of RGB hubs and a case that I already have set up, and then I need to power them as well. But I just want to show the difference in RGB lighting and other things outside the case. And it's going to be a bit of a mission, because that's either 6 fan connectors. I'm now in the middle of looking at comparing the duo fans and the core fans. And while doing that, or while setting up the core fans, I realised I could do a comparison, and I probably should, because although they wire the same, they are different, and I thought it'd be nice to show off the RGB lighting. So currently, what you'll see is I have it set up on the desk, all 6 fans, now wired into the 5000D airflow, which means I've now got about 13, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 fans. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 fans connected up to that PC, purely so I can show off the RGB lighting differences. So I'm going to get some top-down shots of that to show the differences between them and what they look like. Although one of the things you'll see is they're both white as default, so it's not really showing off the RGB, but it does show sort of how they illuminate differently, so I think that's kind of cool. It is a bit of a nightmare though, because I had to run the 2 RGB controllers. As you can probably see, I've got 2 RGB controllers and then 6 fans running via Y splitter into the system fan header on the motherboard. It's a mess, but if I just crop it in for the video purposes, it will look neater. Hello from future Prawn. It's now actually been like a week since I started that behind the scenes, and this video has gone on a lot longer than I probably intended to. If you've made it this far, thanks very much for watching. The build has gone pretty well. As you can see, I came up with a lot of ideas for that. I've actually created some more videos since then. I did the one I was thinking about on push-pull and whether that was worth it, and things to avoid when doing push-pull. I've yet to get to the versus comparison on the fans, and that's because I'm trying to be thorough on that. So actually, I'm planning on doing a few more videos on the H7 Flow RGB, one of which is how to vertically mount your GPU and the differences in temperature in there, so whether you should or not, and see sort of comparison and how that impacts the temperature of the GPU and overall performance. I want to do that versus on the fan video. I've set up and am doing a video on the placement of the all-in-one cooler. So I actually went through, you've seen if you watched the H7 Flow video that I did a push-pull setup on the front, with fans on both sides. I ended up using the case fans from the front, attach a nose to the radiator, and then the included fans on the other side. And so I took that, did some thermal tests with it, then I removed the front fans, so that it was basically just a standard setup with that radiator, and then I removed the top fans that were set to exhaust and put the radiator on top and put the case fans back on and did tests on that. Actually, it was a pretty interesting test. Make sure you check out that video. Basically, the conclusion was that push-pull did work pretty well, and it kept both the CPU and the GPU cooler than the other two setups for the most part. However, I still think front mounting is a bad idea because you're basically just choking off the system, but it's going to vary from machine to machine. I've got some other things I want to do with that case. I've got a lot going on at the moment, so watch out for more on that. Behind me, you'll also see a pile of Infinity fans, and they are the Lee & Lee Infinity fans. So if you're interested in behind the scenes stuff, those are the standard Infinity fans, 120s and 140s, but I'm going to be getting the reverse ones soon, so the other ones. So I'm going to do a video on that and put them in my Dynamic Evo alongside some other things. I've got a load of stuff I can't talk about that's under embargo, so that's going to be fun. But I want to follow this up with a part 2 behind the scenes, where I'm going to talk about what I did with that radiator placement and why. I've actually been inspired, and I've said this previously, by YouTube comments lately. So on that video on the H7 Flow RGB, I actually had a few people telling me I was wrong with my radiator placement. You shouldn't do tubes down, you shouldn't front mount, which is just ridiculous because they've watched the Gamers Nexus video, misunderstood it entirely, and then come to tell me I was wrong. Hilariously, I then had other people telling me the opposite, and then it's just like people arguing about whether it was right or not, which is hilarious. It seems whatever placement you put your radiator in, there's always someone that wants to tell you you're wrong so they could feel superior because they've watched someone else's video and misunderstood it. It's pretty funny, especially considering how many different radiator builds I've done. Not that I'm an expert on everything, I certainly wouldn't say that, but you know, got some pretty good experience and done a lot of testing on various different sort of formats and setups. It's now nearly 1 a.m. in the morning, and I am sitting here editing video while waiting to hit 77,777 subscribers because I love the alliteration of numbers. But I'm going to finish this behind the scenes up, and then I'm going to do a part 2. I'm going to be doing more of these videos, so let me know if you've made it to the end of this and if there's any more you would like to see or anything particular. I'm going to try and hit a lot of different things in the future. I've got so many ideas, but if you have any more that you'd like to share with me, please feel free. I'm always welcoming ideas, and actually some of my successful videos have been based off YouTube comments or viewers' requests. So appreciate you watching. Hopefully you found this entertaining. I realise it was a bit sort of all over the place. Apologies also for some of the problems I had. There were some technical glitches which hopefully you didn't notice, but where the camera would freeze every now and then despite the audio still working. I don't know what's going on there. I'm going to have to try and fix that and improve it. But I'm hoping to do more behind the scenes as we go forward, improve the audio because the audio was a bit hit and miss as well. and maybe even some live streams. So I'm going to be basically doing a lot more content, a lot more shorts, behind the scenes, live streams, members only stuff. I've got loads more planned for 2023, and watch out for it. Thanks very much for watching.